before 300 national delegates of the Jerry Brown campaign who was assembled in San Francisco. So this is every president since and including Gerald Ford has actually received exhaustive documentation on a fact of inevitable failure, singular solution, and a prescription for immediately converting usury in a mathematically perfected economy, resolving all the issues that you have when you have to appear in court to bow down to foreclosure. So let's go over the history of this so that we can put some of this in perspective, because what are all these people like Ellen Hodgson Brown and Bill Stills and Steven Zarlinga doing, standing up, now in the 11th hour as if they'd identified all these problems and then not even providing solution? Ellen Hodgson Brown's advocated that you could introduce the interest, and now because she's lost all her arguments with me, she's actually morphing her quote-unquote solution into mine, as if she's the author of it, and realizes even what she can recommend to you to do, which is actually solution. Can she articulate these things? No. Has she articulated them? No. But after she listens to this, I bet you will hear her morph her quote-unquote solution ever more so into mine. Still will be wrong, and you will still require me to rectify it. Why? These things have been proven for many years. They're simple, clear facts, and they're indisputable. And if she was a genuine author of solution, she would recognize that the solution already existed before she wrote her quote-unquote book. These things get even uglier than you can imagine. Why? And how can you know this? Well, for instance, after I called the Ron Paul campaign, I was pissed off. I called Dennis Kucinich's presidential campaign. Dennis was on the other side of the aisle, pretty much advocating an end the Fed thing, but I'm sorry, you're not. This was the same mistake that Andrew Jackson made. Now, I didn't really dig up all of this history. I dug up, certain parts of it, which I related to for the purposes of explaining the categoric faults and the fact of singular solution. And what Bill Stills did in his Money Masters video, for instance, is just replicate my history. But he did a very, very preposterous thing, and everybody's thanking him for introducing this history, which you could read on my web pages 10 years before, And so they're all thanking him, but all those people in his so-called Money Masters video were advocates of interest. How could he have identified what was wrong if he's advocating interest and all those people were advocating interest? Well, that's why he had to make a second video, because I pointed out where he was wrong. I've had for, pretty close to 15 years, at least 12 or 13 years, an article, just for instance, invalidating, disproving G. Edward Griffin's assertions that interest doesn't have the consequences that I've just explained to you it can only have. G. Edward Griffin is a friend of Ron Paul's who appears in that video of Bill Stills, the so-called Money Masters video. And, of course, he's an Austrian economist, and they advocate interest. In fact, if you want to go to the von Mises pages and look up how preposterous all this is, there's an article by Hayek, who's one of the, demigods of Austrian, so-called Austrian economists. And Hayek, in his article on so-called free market economy, gives us the reason that he advocates a bank. And if I may quote him, he gives the reason as, quote, because banking can be an extremely profitable business, unquote. You look that up at von Mises Institute right now and find that article, which I wouldn't dare even tell anyone if that was my real reason, but Hayek gives it as his reason for advocating banking. Well, if you bore into the history of Austrian economists, you find a book by von Bawerk, late 1800s, where he lays down his ostensible arguments, which are pretty much a foundation of Austrian economics, and I use that word with reservation. Every time I say it, I want to put quotation marks around it because it's just a lie. It's this process which can only, multiply artificial indebtedness to a bank. It's not even a debt to a bank. They merely publish evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. So von Bawerk goes on for like 5 or 6 chapters of this work, which evidently is largely on interest, and it develops the foundational arguments for interest of the so-called Austrian economists. And do you know what those arguments amount to? 4 or 5 chapters. Most boring material you could ever read in your life. What are they about? He basically spends that much time developing the loosest, most ambiguous argument you can imagine, that the only reason that the world has any complaint against interest is religious sentimentality. Your jaw should be dropped. What do you mean? There's no mathematic analysis? Of course not. We're Austrian economists. You can't use mathematics to determine, cause of failure, injustice, to account for anything because, quote, economics involves indeterminate human behavior, unquote. Okay? Well, if you actually go back to the founders of this idea, or the original assertions of the people who authored these preposterous notions, you actually find that the modern Austrian economist even deviates from the original rule. Okay? They actually meant not to use, to try to apply mathematics to things that it couldn't be applied to. But that inherently involves determining whether or not mathematics can resolve the issue. Can mathematics tell you how much interest you have to pay on your debt, given a certain rate of interest? Absolutely. We all experience this every day. But the Austrian economists, when you use that principle to determine the maximum possible lifespan of any economy based on interest-bearing debt, the Austrian economist claims, oh, you can't use math. Why? Because you're proving interest is destructive to us when we're advocates of it. They just are complaining because it invalidates the whole lie of Austrian economists. So they want you out of their forum. They're tired of hearing, this, and they try and give you some other idea that interest is somehow justified. But where is it? They claim it's got to be a signal to commodities traders so they can screw us all the harder. That's all an Austrian economist and all these forums actually, amount to in the end. So, the thing is then, so what has happened over all these years? Why is this plagiarism and why is this purpose denial of representation important for us to understand? It's important for us to understand because in order to solve our problems, we have to understand who's opposed to us and what a solution is, and how we're going to get there from here. And that's really what this is all about. What's the end game? How do we, once we do understand whether or not there is a singular solution, how do we get there from here? Well, number one, we're never going to get there if we as a people can't unite. And believe me, we will unite at least when we're standing in soup lines together and we don't have anything else to talk about. And somebody brings up the fact that, hey, interest can only cause terminal failure, and you're in a soup line and you don't have a house because you didn't want to understand that in time. And you made the rest of us subject to the same consequences. And so here we all are together now. And guess what? We do have to wake up someday. Or we can keep coming to the soup line and hope that is good enough for the rest of us. If it's good enough for you, I guess you can turn me a deaf ear right now. But I'm going to go on explaining to this other guy right here, and I hope you do hear, because you will be in hearing range. So, as I said, at the encouragement of some very disciplined people, for instance, Will McPhee, who was head of the math staff of the University of Colorado, his son Jacques had written him about my economic ideas when I was just 21, and we met a couple years later, and he had me speak in front of most of the faculty of the University of Colorado. At his son's wedding at this huge mansion in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and we spoke into the wee hours of the morning, with I presume at least a number of economists in the room, while I explained that the lie of economy is totally bereft of formal proof or theorem, without a dissenting opinion, and with the great interest of the whole audience. Well, these people encouraged me to pursue these ideas, to see them through, and there was many other people that I met, of course, who encouraged me to do so. And about the time that Richard Nixon was president, I was thinking about presenting mathematically perfected economy to the the highest levels of our government. Well, I never trusted Nixon enough, and even though I didn't trust Ford either, I began to present every president since then, including Gerald Ford. So I never heard back at all from the Ford campaign, although I sent my proposition after a telephone call, certified delivery, return receipt requested. Jimmy Carter became president, so I presented Jimmy Carter after a telephone call, likewise, return receipt requested, certified delivery. Well, an odd thing happened, at least during the Carter administration, and that is that my receipt, which you usually get back in a couple of weeks, was delayed for 6 months. I thought it had been lost, and finally it came, and I thought, wow, that's pretty odd. What have they done? Investigated me as if I'm a subversive here. I'm trying to save my country and even the world by advocating that, I can prove that every purported economy based on interest-bearing debt inevitably terminates itself under insoluble debt. It's already happened once. How have you solved it? If you think you've solved it, And so anyway, then Reagan runs for president, and he announces that he's going to balance the federal budget by decreasing federal taxes 10% per year for 3 years. Of course, he doesn't say at the time that he's going to give most of this tax break to the rich, and that this is going to offset, if not solve, he didn't say exactly, of course, solve price inflation, calling it erroneously inflation as if it's the same thing. So I called the Reagan campaign and proposed to them that, on the contrary, that I could provide them a mathematic proof that the economy would inevitably fail, that it would even fail in the relatively near term if the Federal Reserve persisted in the extremely elevated interest rates they were charging as a prime rate at the time, and that his proposed 10% per year reductions for 3 years in federal tax rates would neither eradicate price inflation nor balance the federal budget. In fact, I projected that, like Carter before him, that he would accumulate more federal debt than any president before him. Well, from my original proposition, I was asked to send exhaustive papers justifying each of these assertions. So